First of all, this is really about you guys, so I'm actually going to make it really interactive. I want you guys to ask any questions you have. I'll add a little bit to what I'm currently doing as well. So if you think about the cybersecurity space, there's obviously lots of vendors out there that do multiple different things. We have chosen, and candidly, this is my 6th time doing the same exact company, where we come in and help companies that have bought all the technology but don't know how to fully manage it and operationalize that on a 24/7. So typically we come in and we're not going to tell you you need to buy more stuff. Rather, we're going to look at exactly what you have and in a lot of cases eliminate some elements and ultimately look at that output on a 24/7 basis. We also have an IR team, an incident response team. That team reports up to me directly. Primarily because of privilege, so I'll talk about that from a business perspective a little bit as we go through this as well. And then lastly, we have consulting services, so for any of you that are on the compliance side, we're PCI, QSA, CMMC, RPO, done high trust in the past. We do a lot of SOC 2 prep, those types of things as well. If you also wonder, hey, has this guy ever done my job before? I can almost say I have. I started in a network operations center, worked in a SOC, have done all the primary jobs you would imagine that continue to step up, including product management. But I also, at RSA, I ran the CISO office as well as the CIO office. And if you're not aware, RSA was sold. And so we spun it off, and in that process I had this unique experience taking an $800 million business and Dell, who owned us at the time, saying, you get to take none of this with you. So you've got to rebuild your security stack, you've got to rebuild your IT stack, you've got to rebuild everything. And so for 9 months, we basically took a lot of money and then rebuilt the IT, the security infrastructure. And one of the things that I learned during that process, and I'm not sure the rest of the industry really has caught up with this, is that if you talk to Gartner, they're going to say that roughly anywhere from 2 to 6% of your IT budget should be security. Well, what they forget about is that like Palo Alto and all of these other product companies have moved more to subscription. Used to, you paid Palo Alto a couple $100,000, you paid them 17, 18% a year, and that was kind of your operational budget. Now, when you buy and this is nothing against Palo Alto, I'm just using them as an example. Everybody does the same thing. But when you look at their subscription models now, you still buy it for a couple $100,000, but at the end of the day, there is a huge subscription that you have to buy into, URL filtering, firewall filtering, all those things that can be 50 or 100% of your original purchase now annually. So as the industry matures and adds more SaaS services and operational types of solutions in the marketplace, you'll see your operational budget go up, you'll see your product budget potentially go down over time as well. And I'll talk about a little bit of that as we go through. So as part of categorizing this, you'll see a lot of times I try to put everything in 3s and 4s because I tend to find that executive levels gravitate towards what they can remember, which is usually no more than 3 and 4. I can personally tell you 2 is a limit for me, but 3, I can usually get away with. But we'll talk about business email compromise, which is probably the biggest problem we're seeing in the marketplace right now. The number of cases that we get coming in every month is now business email compromise by far more than everything else. Talk about ransomware and what some of the trends we've seen there. Obviously unauthorized access, and then confusion of confirmation of a compromise is another category, because a lot of times we'll get calls, we'll get pulled in, they thought they had been compromised, in reality they haven't. Unfortunately, there's probably equal number of companies that don't call us that are compromised and aren't aware of it as well. But BEC, so business email compromise, I'll talk about that at a high level right now. So how many people in here use Office 365? How many people in here have multi-factor authentication turned on? How many people have a user that they believe right now, if they got text 3 or 4 times that says authorize, 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 that they would just click authorize and let somebody into their network? I assure you that happens about 50% of the time. So brute force on BEC, if you can train your users on one thing, is if you have multi-factor authentication, make sure they understand that that is a way to get compromised, because it is the #1 way that we see business emails being compromised right now. And once they're in, right? And unfortunately, hopefully, they don't get admin access through one of your admin users. Second thing in BECs, you know what the first search is on an email box when they break into a BEC? So, two things. #1 is they're looking for any admin credentials. So if anybody's sent on any type of admin credentials. #2, they're looking, and there's 3 things. Remember 3. So #2 is, do they have any other access into systems that they got to reset on, which is most likely, again, their email plus whatever this password is. And the third biggest thing is their insurance policy, their cyber insurance policy. What is the maximum payout on their cyber insurance policy is a high target right now. And so what they're looking for, and again, we'll talk about cyber insurance in a few minutes, is how much can they ask your boss, your ultimate boss that can authorize the payment for a ransomware situation without you being personally hurt as a company or as individuals in the company. Because the way they look at it is, if you have a $5 million payout and the insurance company is going to pay it, you're probably not going to argue a lot under whatever that threshold is. Ransomware, so we're going to talk about ransomware a lot of this presentation, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Unauthorized access into legitimate tools, you're using it for bad purposes, desktop remote access. We still see, after COVID hit, that remote desktop access was opened up in most organizations, and unfortunately we still see it today. There is a higher remote access on port level open today than pre-COVID. So organizations, with remote admin access and various other users, sometimes MFA, not usually, because we can ping it from the outside world as well. Stolen credentials, and this is, how many people have a dark web monitoring service? Yeah, it's hard to use. So if you subscribe to a dark web monitoring services, they'll have bad URLs, they'll have bad, all types of bad information. One of the things that they will show you is compromised users. Unfortunately, compromised users, once it's compromised, they don't go away in that report. And so you're constantly looking to see when the last update was and if you've reset their credentials since that time. And so if you think about that sequence, you've got to make sure that whatever dark web subscription you have continually updates those dates, that the last time they've got that data, there was a compromise. And you're going to have to possibly continue to reset that user's credentials. Here's the good news. It's almost the same 20% of your organization over and over and over and over again. So it should tell you something about that 20% of the organization as well. Okay, so where is the #3 geographical area or country that generates attacks against the U.S.? So we're going to put the general area of Middle East, which includes a few of those, in one category. We're going to put Russia and China in another category. Where's the 4th one? Ukraine. So historically, Ukraine and Russia had people that cooperated with each other. They would build attack software, malware, and then they would use it. And there were people on either side. So Ukraine would build malware and Russia would use it. Russia would build malware, Ukraine would use it. And so what happened with the conflict is that supply chain of ransomware broke. So literally the 30 days after the conflict started, ransomware attacks and ransomware claims dropped off 85%. Now, some of it is because, Russia sold to Middle East and various other areas, and the same thing with Ukraine. So now that that supply chain has stabilized, people that were building and operating have aligned on each side of the border, and the same thing within Ukraine, we have now started seeing the claims go back up. We've now started seeing all of the ransomware start to re-innovate within those areas, because historically the innovation was primarily within Russia and the Ukraine. So what we're seeing now is they have moved away from the US targets during a period of time which were military, financial, and infrastructure that were aligned to Ukraine or Russia being attacked, and now we're seeing the broad attacks coming back to life again. I'll pause here. Questions on this one?
So Russia lost a lot of talented people due to the exodus of skilled people.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to affect this pipeline of ransomware, or do you think that's going to?
Yeah, I would say, generally speaking, and I'm not sure if your discussion point was because they went into the Army and therefore, or if it was in general them leaving the country, or, yeah. So a lot of tech people, and candidly, even within Ukraine, have left the individual countries and relocated. Now, some of both have relocated to other areas that are more friendly, and they can continue to still use the skills that they had, just with different sponsorship as well. I don't believe over, call it the next year, that the disruption that have occurred here will do anything but grow faster and more aggressively than it ever has before. You also end up with people in both of these categories trying to fund things back in their home countries as well. So there's more motivation than previously as well. Yes, sir.
So not too long after the shooting started, I received a briefing, and there was a question about taking a look at the malware. What level of sophistication were they going to be deploying? In your experience, have you seen that the Russians or the Ukrainians are holding back the sophistication of their malware, perhaps for a different phase or a different aspect of the conflict?
Yeah, so I live in the DC area, so do a lot of stuff with the government as well. I would put it in this category. Most of the attacks that we've seen historically on ransomware, and candidly any malware, has not been overly sophisticated. It's taken advantage of really low-level vulnerabilities and and misconfigurations a lot of times. Outside of power and utility, arguably, there hasn't been a lot of really, really sophisticated stuff out there. Knowing our own capabilities, I would say they have held back a lot. And most likely that won't be used against commercial targets because I think the consequences at a government level would be pretty severe on either side. So, and I would just say, and again, I'm prior military, I'm all US, but, we're no saints in the world sometimes ourselves. And so the fact that some organizations and government sponsorships do certain things, there are certain lines nobody should cross. And I think a couple times those have been crossed, and that's where you start seeing the politics, appropriately rise to the level. But I would say it would be naive of us to believe that, anybody has not got a higher capability than has been demonstrated in the marketplace today. That's not to say that there's not stuff deployed that is not detectable at this point, or that we all have software or hardware that is deployed within our environments that potentially have capabilities that are beyond our detection capabilities on a day-to-day basis as well. So, I worked at AT&T as well. I ran security. We had PhDs that rewrote, C, as an example, code to be able to obfuscate global things. One of the things we did in a lab was test things for years to see if it ever called out. So in other words, it was sitting idle in your environment. An average enterprise, if it calls out once a year with a small packet load, you're just not going to detect it. Versus if you completely close it down and monitor it, a lot of us in the industry will do that. We'll lock up things that we have suspicion on. We've been fortunate to partner with a number of DoDs that give us access to things we could not afford as an organization. So on the SCADA side, I'm not going to go out and buy a multi-million-dollar system for testing, a power and utility company, but if you can get access to those through partnerships and various other things, those are always good things to have. But long answer to no, they have not thrown everything at us at this point, nor have we thrown everything at them either. So.
As the more generalized attacks come out, have you noticed any trends in what type of attacks they're favoring? Are they going back to the ransomware? Are they targeting more operational technology like power grid, or are they doing other things?
So as a industry, healthcare is probably the #1 target right now. It's not always tremendously bad, but a lot of discovery, and then BEC is the big one right now, and BEC doesn't take a lot of technology skill, and so in the interim, there's been a lot of gravitation and success on BECs. I would say, on average, we get, and we're a relatively small company, we probably get 20 BECs a week, where we have to go in and clean up an enterprise. So, other questions? Okay, so here's the #1 thing. How many of you have ever been through a breach? Not necessarily identifying your current organization, but how many of you have been through a breach? Yeah, it's an eye-opening experience, right? So the first thing is, if you're like most organizations, you jump to the assumption that if somebody claims you've been breached, that you have been breached. And by the way, that's a right response initially. However, what we have seen is in about 4%, not a huge number, but in about 4% of all organizations, they have already paid or started paying ransomware before they confirm that they've actually got any proof that they've taken data, locked down any data, extracted any data as well. And so that's a huge number if you look at the billions of dollars that are paid out in ransomware every year. And so, our first thing is confirm that somebody has actually been ransomed before, and get proof. For 2 reasons. Candidly, it buys us some time, so we can figure out what they actually have access to, and then proof that they actually have access to current information. Because what we often get on the first round is old information, and so the first thing we'll say is, look, yeah, I see this. This is from 1992. That's good. Sorry you got access to that. Show me something more current, and potentially even give them systems that we want them to show data on that are the most current and the most critical systems to that organization. Specifically, we're trying to figure out if you're tripping any of the PII laws or HIPAA or PCI or whatever it may be that's associated with you. But I would guess if you're in business, you probably will tick a PII law in some state.
What percentage of the ransomware also involves extortion from the data store?
So probably, and I'd have to go back and look at the exact numbers. So we can identify pretty quickly if they had any level of extraction of data out of your environment. Typically, if we can catch it early, we're going to be able to see that in various log firewalls and various other things. The distinction there is, did they encrypt your data and it's sitting in your environment and they took nothing out, which is actually a really important piece of information, right? Because if you ask me if there is no proof that they've extracted data out of your environment and they've encrypted your environment, there's a higher degree that you're safer by paying the ransomware and them doing nothing with it. Now, we have seen, and this is a new trend, so again, the supply chain of ransomware is intriguing if you don't understand it. So the people that steal the data, they actually pay somebody else to store and encrypt the data. So they don't have their own servers and storage and AWS instances set up. They actually pay a sub for this. And more than, call it 10 times this year, and it's early in the year, we have seen the sub come back to the client. Yeah, you paid him, but I got your data. He doesn't have your data. He doesn't even have the keys to your data. I got your data. And ask for a second extortion on that data. Now, of course, the customer always wants to know, well, should I pay them? And my thing is like, look, if you have your data and backup and restore on all this other stuff, I'm not sure I trust the guy that's a criminal to the criminal. Like now we've taken one step further. The frontline criminal, he has a reputation because if he doesn't release your data and give you the keys, then he's going to get a reputation really fast and nobody's going to pay him. The bad guy behind the scenes, yeah, you got a double criminal there.
Oh, and they also fight each other
Oh my God, yeah.
and steal the data from them while they have your data.
Yeah. Well, and again, the last 6 months, what we've seen too is when the supply chain got broke, there was new teaming, and they didn't work well together. So they started fighting with each other. They started, arguing. You would get, and the worst part is you would get, okay, yeah, I'll take $50,000 and and we're good, and they come back and they're like, oh no, my partner needs 100. So it's like, whoa. Who are we negotiating with?
What are some of the interesting methods of exfiltration that you're seeing these days?
So there's been a bunch of new ones that are at application level. So if you think about ways not to trip all your internal alerts, for example, if they've broken credentials in multiple different areas, we have seen where they'll upload into a Salesforce, a ServiceNow, some type of SaaS application within their environment that will then extract out that nobody's watching nearly as closely with. We've seen the email compromise in combination with ransomware, where they will take and they'll email data out. It's a little more clunky and it's most likely going to get caught, but you can get a lot of data out before the alarms start going off. We have also seen where they've broken into, as many of you know, network monitoring capabilities, where they've at least been able to see what ports are in use and being able to be open, where they'll actually export on ports that are open in your environment on an outbound, which, most organizations are fairly good at inbound blocking, not so good at outbound blocking, nor do they have the trigger set up for payload. So a lot of times that will be another way that they'll exfiltrate. We have seen throttling a lot at the malware level, where they'll take and they'll slowly send data out over multiple different periods of time. Service accounts in AD, where they create new accounts, have happened more and more all the time. Like if you talk to AIG as your insurer, cyber insurer, service accounts is one of their top ransomware questions. As far as being able to create new accounts and set up and elevate accounts as well.
What about something kind of interesting like specialized DNS queries or images?
Yeah, so we don't see a lot of that because the most recent recommendations that we've sent out, and we work with FBI and law enforcement and various other ones, have been around protection of DNS and AD. So it may be an echo chamber to a little degree. So people that know us call us when they have problems versus if it's happening in other areas. I'm on I'm on the ransomware task force for a company called Net Diligence, which we work with all the cyber insurance companies, and that one hasn't elevated to my radar at least. Data exfiltration we talked about, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Investigation and validation. So who's the first person you should call outside of your company if you have a breach? Legal counsel. So if you call me and we start working your case, and then the AG of the state gets involved, which they often do, and they call us to get data, which we say no, like auto response no, they have no access to any data that came in under privilege. You have to call the lawyer, you have to work. If we start working it before your lawyer is engaged, technically they can subpoena any data that was captured, looked at, reviewed, suggestions, et cetera, before your attorney got involved with us. So from a legal perspective, we always ask you to bring in your legal representation immediately. It can be an internal counsel, but generally we're going to want outside counsel involved as well.
Do you see the counsels actually hiring you on behalf of the customer?
So how many people are familiar with the Capital One case? Anybody work for Capital One? No, don't raise your hand, never mind. Anybody? The Capital One case, in summary, and anybody can correct me if I get any of this wrong, is that operational data got munged with the actual breach itself. The team started working, data, started crossing over. We, by default, if you came and said today, hey, we want to buy IR retainer and we want to buy MDR operation environment, we will do two things. Number one, we'll talk to your counsel and make sure they're comfortable with that. But then we will have the contracts done exactly as you described, where all IR retainer work and retention, any retainer work or engagement is actually purchased by the lawyer and paid to us and contracted to us. And the operational data is managed by CIO or whoever's office is managing day-to-day operations. Legal counsel says that you can actually have the internal organization separate those out, where you have a CISO or your GC or somebody that's not in the chain of the CIO contract directly with a vendor, and then have the operational contract under a different one with the same common MSA. We do that. I tend to say, if there is a weak area, go for the strongest argument you can have. So if you can have an outside counsel contract your IR firm, then to me that's a little more cleaner and a little bit more protected. But always call your lawyer first. And if your lawyer has not dealt with breaches, get another lawyer as well. Now, and I don't mean that against anybody that's a generalist. I just mean, like, there is specialty here that can, be compromised if you don't do it right. Also, how many people have cyber insurance? So my first recommendation would be always have cyber insurance. It's more expensive than it ever has been, but it's relatively cheap in the grand scheme of the likelihood of you having a breach. So, for example, we are considered a service provider, so a professional services organization, in security with data in the cloud. So from an insurance perspective, you can't get a worse combination than that. If we were offshore, that would probably be worse. But generally speaking, those are bad combinations. So our cyber insurance is $5 million. And within that policy, when I started 3 years ago, it was $15,000, and it's now $65,000. $65,000 for $5 million, I'm managing 200-300 customers' data points. Like, that seems like a good deal in the grand scheme of things. They have what is called a ransomware supplement, which is their ability to ask you supplemental questions to get your cyber insurance. In 2020, the average acceptance rate of a policy, new or renewal, was around 95%. in the last 2 years, both renewals as well as new policies has fallen to 50%. So what you don't want to be as a CEO is a guy that goes back to your board and says, yeah, we're not good enough to be able to get cyber insurance. Not a good conversation, I assure you. So we've spent a lot of time documenting what the ransomware policies are, or ransomware questionnaires, sorry, that are coming from the cyber insurance, because ransomware is what turned cyber insurance upside down as a business. So before, most businesses, have a claim rate of 60, 70, 80% on the bad side. They were having 110% in 2020, which means they're losing, just for clarity there. And so if you think about that process, what they're trying to do is filter out the people that aren't doing the basics. So they're asking you questions like, do you have multi-factor authentication? They don't ask where, they don't ask with all users, they don't ask, admin access. They don't ask all those questions. Now they're starting to get better at that. So before it was, do you have multi-factor authentication? Sure. I got RSA. Did you turn it on? That was never a question. Do you have service accounts? Yeah, I have 83. Well, that's probably not so good, especially since you're a 30-person organization. So these are the types of questions that were originally asked. Good intention, do you have multi-factor authentication? Valid question. The fact that you only have it on VPN and you have 20 static accounts and you still have remote desktop access and you don't use it for any of your admins, not so good, right? So this is where they're getting better and better. So we took 100 questions across 5 of the major providers, munged them together, and we provide our clients guidance as to what they need to be mapping towards over time as well. Second thing is, where is a major problem when you have controls? How many of you use NIST 853 or, okay. And if you think about a lot of the policy and control reviews, policy is one thing, but control reviews every year, you sit in a room, you go through it, everybody goes, yeah. Half the time they're not even reading these things. In a business less than $250 million, on average, 50% of the time when we ask them for their controls, what they give us, they haven't even filled in the blanks. So they downloaded 853 or some other standard, maybe even paid ISO, for a fee, never changed the name on the top, never filled in any of the blanks, never did anything. And the first question, you get to like page 3, where it's password, level, and you're like, do you do this? Yes. Do you have an AS400? Oh yeah. You don't do this. There's no way you do this with a password control level. So the legal nightmare is you say you do something that you don't do. It is far better not to do it and not document that you do it, because that's the first thing a good lawyer is going to look at. You said you did this. How many executives review this and sign off on it every year? Every single time. How long have you been doing this? 12 years. So you've been lying to everybody for the last 12 years. That's the storyline. 4 CSOs, 5 CIOs, and you're saying that nobody really read this. How can we expect your security to be good? Storyline. Okay. Breach. So what are you protecting in an organization? I'm sorry? But truly, take a step back.
Reputation.
No, forget the higher level. Are you protecting data? Right? But also processes. At the end of the day, those are the 2 primary things you're protecting. Data and processes. And so now you can start inventorying what would happen to my business if this system got impacted. Does it provide access to data? Lack of availability for that data? Same thing with processes. Because a lot of companies live more on processes than data, right? So, and if you think about healthcare, you think about manufacturing, you think about OT and IoT and all these other environments, it's a lot of processing, not so much the data. And so more and more, what you're really trying to build a security program around are processes and, again, legacy data as well. So what does it impact? I'm not going to walk through every one of these. The key thing here is being able to explain this to people that are funding security, funding your IT investments. Associated with that, we break it down into these areas. Now, this maps back into MITRE and a few other areas as well, so simplified pretty significantly. But you can talk about the investments that you're making using this, and I'll share this, or it can be made available to you guys afterwards as well. But can people find out stuff about my environment, get access to things that they're not supposed to have access into in the environment, and start looking at any of that data? So how many people know confidentiality, integrity, availability? So I would add to that as we move more into a process-driven world where you've got things like healthcare devices attached to you and so forth, that in addition to what you were talking about before was reputation, revenues, mission, those types of things, safety becomes a big one. So the first thing we ask clients when we walk in and we start talking about ultimately protecting their environment is, what infrastructure do you have in place that can impact human life? Processes is what most people think of on OT types of healthcare, attached to your body type of stuff. But also don't forget that if I change your medical records to be something that I'm not allergic to, that they use day to day, like penicillin, for example, you could kill somebody. So thinking about it in how can I make sure people's health is protected at the top level? And I think most executives, most organizations would recognize that health trumps revenue, trumps reputation, so forth, because all those other things get impacted. So going through this real quick though, reconnaissance and resource development, figuring out what I can actually launch towards your environment, what are your vulnerabilities, what access can I get into your environment, and then from execution perspective, how can I get in your environment, do something with that knowledge, and then defense evasion, what we were talking about before. How can I get in your environment, get embedded, do things I want to do without you detecting that from occurring? Sadly, if people remember the Verizon report from 10 years ago, it said the average dwell time, as we refer to it, in your environment was like a year plus, right? Guess what it is now? Year plus. So it drops down in certain reports, you'll see 5-6 months, but in reality, if you look at the average IR engagement we do, it's been more than a year. So we're not getting better. Discovery, what can they find out once they're behind your lines, being able to figure out if there is anything that they can extract and so forth. Lateral movement, then collection, and then command and control, so I can actually pull that data out of your environment or lock up whatever you've got.
So what are your thoughts on the dwell time? Is it a backlog and they just can't get to everything? Or is it because they're doing a little mini missions and then finally they do something more aggressive and they get caught?
Yeah, so there's two things. So the first one is hackers aren't notoriously patient, nor should they be from an extraction perspective. What we believe is in most cases, it's taken an extended period of time to get the lateral movement within the customer's environment. So the way that most of us measure dwell time is when did we have indications that they initially got into your environment. And by the way, there is a fair amount of, when it comes to dwell time, guessing that goes into this, because most customers outside of regulatory industries do not retain records long enough to be able to go back 12 months, right? The second thing is that and I'll say we, but generally MDR players, MSSP players, when we get in the environment, we find something within 30 days. So it's basic monitoring that most people haven't done. And again, believe me, I ran security at RSA and IT at RSA. I woke up every morning thinking about what we hadn't done, right? And there's just an endless list of things that needed to be done, even in a new stand-up environment. So, I think it's two-part. One, monitoring capabilities are pretty much non-existent in a lot of clients, and even when they get a MDR, MSSP, SIM, whatever it may be, they have a tendency to have a lot of blind spots within that environment, because you're probably not going to go and put a network sensor in every segment. You're probably not, looking for type of east, west, north, south types of environments, depending on what part of the network you're in. And so it is very hard, but I would say most organizations aren't mature enough to be able to detect it, is the reality of the situation. And how many people have high vulnerabilities in your environment right now? Everybody, right? And so how many people have a high vulnerability set in 6 levels below multi-factor authentication in your management infrastructure, where the likelihood of anybody getting access is not high, as compared to having a medium vulnerability setting in your DMZ? So we as an industry haven't done a great job of prioritizing as well, because compliance says patch the high. Reality is a medium setting in your DMZ is far more dangerous than a high setting 6 levels down behind multiple levels of security that 2 guys have access to, right? One of which left last week, and so now you're really... Questions on any of this? Again, I don't want to spend a whole time trying to go through each one of these, but I want to make sure that my biggest thing is that in the industry, we don't simplify enough for the business executives to give us the money we need to be able to do. They're never going to give us enough. But if we can do a better job of formulating it in things that they can understand and work towards, and you can show value, then that's going to be a positive.
With the advent of third wave AI, are you seeing any less ransomwares?
So you bought that story from that vendor, didn't you? No. So look, there is some really cool stuff in the marketplace. If you really think about how AI and ML works, most of the vendors that are peddling it aren't using a lot of AI and ML. If you look at like some of the new EDR agents, CrowdStrike and some of those guys, SentinelOne, either Microsoft, they're doing some cool stuff. Why? Because they have huge amounts of access to operational data that's coming in continuously. And so if you have a vendor that is relatively small, et cetera, they're not going to have access to make, even if they had great AI and ML in place, great uses out of it, because it's just not going to learn fast enough in the grand scheme of things. Second of all, there is a lot of hyper, BS out there, for lack of better words, that really, when you start pulling the thread of what they call AI and ML, it really is not all that. I think the threat, going back to the question earlier about have they thrown all the hard stuff at us right now, because there is some really cool stuff out there. That's probably the thing we have to worry about the most. If you think about it from, being the guys that have rules compared to the guys that don't have rules, like some really bad stuff could happen with AI, right? ML a little less, but AI could be really, really bad stuff on the cybersecurity side. could be bad for a lot of things, but cybersecurity specifically. It's not the thing that is keeping us up at night right now. You know, we don't see, you know, processes changing, you know, every nanosecond based on some AI, you know, talking algorithm that, you know, gets either remotely controlled or transplanted within your environment. That's just not where we are yet today. But again, the good news is, you know, all of us are investing in it, but it hasn't quite, you know, shown the value that a lot of people, you know, will believe that it does. Again, I would say EDR is higher value. Arguably, some of the firewall stuff is high value, but they don't take the feedback as much as like the EDR agents do, which are typically in the cloud. And Microsoft's made a lot of great investments in that area as well. You know, given their challenges with security in the past and the fact that they own, you know, an OS as well as many applications, they have. I will give them credit for doing a lot of cool stuff and making investments. Other questions?
One more question, non-related to AI.
Mhm.
Since you're talking about anatomy of a breach,
Mhm.
I was wondering if you can comment last month on Dish Network ransomware, any thing you could share how it happened?
So I'm precluded from talking about that particular one. So, I think most of you know what that means. So, so just for clarity, if you ever hear a vendor say that, it means they were involved in some way, and we're not allowed to talk about it for legal privilege reasons associated with it.
So in more near term, the 3CX breach?
Again. So anytime you talk about particular customer areas that may touch multiple different customers, we are on 24 insurance panels. And so we get pulled into almost everything. And even if we don't work some of the cases, we're precluded from talking about it in public. But happy to talk to you, not on stage.
One question?
Yes.
Two-part. I've been hearing
Oh,
about...
real fast. There is a webinar on the 11th
Yes.
that we'll be talking about with the FBI, and we're speaking about that publicly. So I'll make sure you guys have access to that as well.
Okay, two parts. I'm hearing about a trend where this ransomware is kind of a multi-trick pony, where backdoors are also part of that equation.
Mhm.
Is that something that you're seeing a lot? And the second part is that I feel like we're so hyper-focused on ransomware,
Mhm.
when the Ukraine is seeing a massive proliferation of wiper malware, which I think is just a matter of time before it all just turns westward and towards, you know, Europe and the rest of us.
Yeah, so I think there's the question of motivation,
Yeah.
right? And so there's not a huge motivation outside of politics for somebody to do something to anybody, but the U.S. specifically, without a payment of some sort. So if they are focused on smaller areas that they can prove their capabilities and then ask for something, then that's probably how we will see it evolve. Unfortunately, until they show that capability, it's hard for most organizations to justify making a payment. But worse is that, or worse for them, not for us, is if we can identify how they did that a couple times, then most likely those defenses are going to be adjusted pretty quickly in the grand scheme of things. Now, there's always the first, right? There's always those early people that are used, or organizations used as a company, as an example to drive fear in the marketplace as well. So we haven't seen a lot of that in the US, which are primarily our client areas. And most of our US clients have international presence, and we haven't seen them in any of the international presence as well. We don't do work in the Ukraine specifically, or Russia for that matter, obviously. So, did I address your first question?
The backdoor part.
Yeah, so we always assume there's backdoor. So about 90% of clients that get breached amp up their monitoring capabilities after the fact. And so during that, we were always obviously looking for monitoring or any type of backdoor type of things. Now, again, they're not patient. So usually you catch those pretty early. Because what they do know too is when an organization gets breached, that's when the pocketbook opens up and they start spending a lot on security. So in almost every instance, you know, when an organization gets breached, they're going to have 24/7 monitoring. They're going to have, you know, new capabilities. They're going to have EDR. They're going to have all types of things that they never had before put in place, and the bad guys know that as well. So they'll see that amplification follow. So they tend to not be patient, but monitoring for any type of backdoors is a key.
So when you do incident response, are you also deploying your own EDR type tool, or are you just leveraging what the customer else?
So both. So if the customer already has something in place that we can tap into, so you know, a SIEM, a log management, an EDR solution that already exists, we will deploy our own if they don't have one. So we prefer SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, and Microsoft as our 3 primary supported, but we will support Cylance, we'll support you know, Cisco AMP, will support, you know, go down the line as well. You know, you smile at the AMP words, yeah, so that's but we just did an engagement with Cisco where the customer had AMP deployed, and it, you know, turned it up, you know, as far as capabilities for monitoring and detection, it was not bad. So, but we support it as a monitoring. We wouldn't manage it. Sorry.
So the customers you are engaged with, if they have these solutions, EDR, SIEM, and monitoring capabilities,
Mhm.
what's the cause that they are still getting breached?
So first of all, you know, I'll talk from the. Let's start with a SIEM. So I would say 95% of people that have SIEM, log management, whatever, don't have 24/7. So that's one, right? Number 2, 24/7 monitoring, people eye on glass looking at the thing. So it's great that you got a log that said you got compromised or system access or whatever it is. It's another thing if nobody does anything with that log. Again, arguably creates more of a liability than not. The second thing is a lot of monitoring capabilities in-house or out-of-house are rarely widely deployed. They tend to be on what they consider most critical assets, on a regulatory compliance area, whatever it may be, and ultimately the compromise occurs somewhere else. And again, if they stole credentials, you know, if they're doing what looks to be legitimate business, arguably they're going to get away with something at that point. So there's 2 guarantees in life when it comes to cybersecurity and MSSP and SIEMs, is the customer doesn't like either one of them, right? So, and I say that as an MSSP and MDR because our clients fall into one of 2 categories. Is I haven't been breached this year. What did you do for me? You're not showing me value, right? Like, wait a second. You just said you haven't been breached this year, right? Number 2 is that you send me too much. So, you know, our number, you know, we'll call it our top 3 our top 3 competitors in the space. First question we ask if we know it's one of those 3 is, how many alerts did you get yesterday? And the answer is usually a lot. Or, you know, it may be a week or maybe a month. And the reality is a fatigue. I called one client, I was talking to him personally because I knew him, and he used a vendor, I won't say who, and I said, well, you know, how high value are the alerts? It's like, not very. I have a mailbox set up that I put all my alerts in the mailbox, and then I check it once a day. Oh, I haven't looked at it in a while. He went in, he hadn't received an alert in 6 months. So something broke, didn't even get alerts and didn't even know about it in the grand scheme of things. So again, just because you do something, if you don't do it well, the possibility of you still having a problem are pretty high.
Number 3, why they don't like you is when they do actually get breached.
Well, we try to avoid that one altogether. But yes, that is 100% true.
With a lot of the traffic nowadays encrypted, I mean, you can do monitoring, but unless
Good point.
SSL decryption, right? I mean,
Yep. So, and that's another point, is so if you have a network sensor and it doesn't have decryption capabilities, then you're going to miss stuff, right? Like, I mean, that's a legitimate way that something can be exfiltrated in your environment. Even if you have an encryptor capability within your environment, I assure you, Google's not giving you their keys. Yahoo's not giving you their keys. You know, go down that list, right? Your bank's not going to give every enterprise their keys. So all of a sudden, you know, you have blind spots that most people just completely ignore, other than maybe the IP address or the URL. And so if those get monitored and they're going to a bad, you know, place, then, you know, that's a legitimate catch. But you don't know what was in it. You may know payload if you're lucky.
So the EDR is supposed to send that type of information to SIM, and SIM was promised as the center of this intelligent data to give you that information about what's going on in the enterprise or organization.
Yep.
Is that not happening?
So this is not a yes or a no question, right? So everybody knows what EDR is, endpoint detection and response. So EDR is, if you said make one investment in my environment today, I would argue make EDR. It's a great technology. It generally works better than most things. Depends on which one you buy. You may still need AV. Most likely you do. So they have different roles that aren't necessarily combined yet today. So always remember, you know, just because you have AV doesn't mean, just because you buy EDR doesn't mean you have AV, because those are different things. They will detect IOCs at the app unencrypted level, which is a good thing, right? So now you don't have the encryption transit problem, but you still have the proof point type of problem where the IOC isn't bad until later. So what happened to your system in the interim of that IOC being flagged as bad? And most people do not have EDRs deployed correctly. So most are going to deploy EDR in its most generic form, where maybe they have 2 or 3 profiles set up. An average, call it $10 million, $50 million company that has multiple functions running, which is a small company, right, should have upwards of 25 to 50 profiles set up in their EDR. Because engineering, what they're working on, what they're developing may be completely different than what your sales guys are using. And those EDR settings should be significantly different. You should have an EDR defined for your DNS, if you have DNS in-house, because you probably can't whitelist your organization, right? You can't whitelist applications across your entire environment today. Most companies can. But you could whitelist what sits on your DNS. You could whitelist what sits on your AD, as an example. So if you can whitelist on servers that are of high value, you should absolutely do that. And that's going to create multiple profiles that are going to make your security a lot tighter. Where's the number one compromise for ransomware? If you're going to access one thing, compromise one thing in your environment, what would you do if you're trying to deploy ransomware? AD. Game over if they get your AD. So if you walk out one thing tonight and you have internal AD especially, go protect your AD, because that's the crown jewels when it comes to ransomware. And it is really understated in the marketplace in the grand scheme of things too. And there are some new cool applications. I think Tenable just bought somebody, Central One bought somebody. Neither one of the companies have fully operationalized those products yet outside of their standalone capabilities, but eventually I think they will. Other questions? So as I mentioned before, risk to revenue, reputation, regulatory requirements, and safety. If you're in healthcare, if you're in manufacturing, you're in whatever that touches human life or health, make sure that that gets moved to the top of the list, not the bottom of the list, which is what usually happens. And these, by the way, almost every executive can remember. Because they remember most of them already. Preservation of evidence. If you engage an IR firm, they should be within 4 hours, roughly speaking, assuming they have access, be able to get all the data that they need to make sure that they understand what happened in your environment. Much more than that period of time, is not. They've got to have automation and capabilities in place. Usually, you can do this within about 30 minutes if you have a retainer in place, because now they already have access. They've already set up everything, et cetera, et cetera. But being able to make sure that those back doors, those misconfigurations, how they got in, what they exfiltrated, et cetera, is key. Because your lawyer's question is going to be, what data got exfiltrated from my environment or from your environment? And if you can say none, no PII regulations kick off, no PCI, no HIPAA, none of those things. If you can show that no exfiltration will happen. Now, I will tell you, more than a few executives in client customers have said, can you prove there was exfiltration? Well, no, because you didn't have monitoring set up. You didn't have logs turned on. If you can't prove that you had exfiltration, there was no exfiltration. Between you and your lawyer, not me. Because that seems like an unhealthy conversation to have with somebody trying to prosecute you later. I'll use a real world example. So a client, not a client, they became a client. We identified that they had 10,000 PII records for their employees loaded on an internet-facing unprotected server. CIO said, can you prove that somebody accessed that? No, because you have no logs turned on. There's no access records, you don't have a firewall in front of it, no, I can't prove that. Then it didn't happen. Once again, not my decision. That's your business decision to make. If I get subpoenaed, I assure you, I'm going to call your lawyer to represent the situation, because I'm not going to speak to that point. So as you go through these processes, think about it from a legal perspective as well, because if you can protect the business by doing basic things, get the lawyer involved early, making sure that flow goes through the lawyer, that's all a positive thing. What's the one thing that can't be protected under privilege?
Illegal activity?
Facts. Believe it or not, a fact can't be protected by privilege. So if I tell you, for example, here is exactly how they got in your environment, here's exactly when they got in your environment, here is everything that occurred, the lawyer will claim privilege and he'll hold it up in court. But at the end of the day, that's a fact. Those are facts that we gave you. And so what you want to do, going back to an earlier question, is break apart all the operational facts from legal opinion as possible. So if a lawyer says, did they access this record? The answer is, I have no indications that that record was accessed. And that's what the lawyer wants to hear, because that's the best defense right there. On the flip side, you know what the other lawyer's going to be saying. an average PC exposed to the internet for more than 10 minutes is compromised. You're telling me an Excel file sitting on the internet for more than 3 months wasn't exposed? But you can't prove it. Like, then it's a whole bunch of elements. But technically, privilege does not protect facts. It only protects business questions that occur from a lawyer asking you those. And that's a really fine line. We did an hour-long webinar with several lawyers that couldn't agree to any of the key points in that conversation. I'm running up on time, so I'm going to pause here. I'm happy to jump into any of this. We do still see when a customer tries to cure, this is the best Friday night call you ever get. We think we've been compromised, and here's what's happened. Well, I assure you, you've been compromised. Okay, I think we can take care of it ourselves. Well, why did you call us? No, we just wanted to confirm that we think we got compromised. And then like 4 months later, they call you back and go, hey, we've been compromised. It's like, you called us 4 months ago, right? Yeah, we've been trying to deal with it internally ourselves. And again, that's not to say there's not capable companies. It's just, if I hear breach, we wake up the company, right? Like, jump in to action. Customers sometimes just don't. And so, you know, you see these re-compromise on a continued basis. You see exfiltration happening even after the fact. You see all of those types of things occurring. Again, litigation, there's lots of elements here that can bite you after the fact as well. And then always take the time to debrief on what went wrong. And when you're going through the breach, you're also probably proactively thinking, could this have happened? Could this happen? Could this have happened? Write those down. Because if they didn't happen this time and you're thinking about them, this is a perfect time to write them down so they don't happen again in the future. Prioritization. If you do a CIA process with an organization, what you usually find is they think everything is not high value or everything is high value, including every PC in the environment. So what you want to do is try to separate those out based on some rules. An average client, call it $2 billion in revenue, is probably going to have around 40 assets that are most critical in their environment. And again, every organization's different. A bank's going to be higher, but maybe lower assets. An organization that is, call it 50 million, is probably going to be SaaS oriented. And so they're going to have a lot of applications and third-party considerations that you have to go through. Why do we still get compromised? Same stuff we were talking about 20 years ago. Over and over again. Okay, questions?
You mentioned log data quite a few times today. I've heard somebody say, hackers can basically modify log data to hide their activities, and really packets are the ultimate source of truth.
Mm-hmm.
So do you really want to monitor log data, or do you want to look at packets?
So first of all, if they can modify your log data, they can modify your packet data.
Okay.
Because usually they're stored in the same location and usually for a smaller frequency of time. And so packet data has a lot of high value if it's unencrypted. So I can look at payload, I can run IOCs against, I can reverse engineer things against it. So for example, if we see a file we don't know in a packet, we'll be able to extract it remotely, and we dump it into a platform we call Hatching, which is owned by Recorded Future, and it reverse engineers the actual file itself to tell us if there's anything in it that is of high suspicion. And so you can't do that with logs. Logs are notoriously generic, but high value. I have only seen one instance in my entire life where we thought maybe, and again, I'm putting a lot of caveats around it, they actually broke into the SIM and changed the modification on the file. First of all, most of those are hashed anyhow, so from an external database access perspective, you're not going to change the file. And second of all is why would I bother? If I have that much access into your environment, again, absent a vendor known vulnerability that provides remote access, so that they're going to turn it off. So the most common thing we're going to see if they can get that level of access is they're going to turn off logging so that nobody's getting alerts. And very few organizations have the ability to detect when log volume falls. So, you don't wake up on Saturday morning and look at your log volume and go, "Oh, I think it's 10% lower than it was, last Saturday," right? Like, it just doesn't happen that often. Organizations are getting better, but that's still a big miss. So, again, I don't want to say I would not put that in my top 100 concerns right now. But packets are high value. They're just very expensive to capture. They're limited by encryption. And most organizations don't keep them more than 7 days. And if your dwell time is 6 and 12 months, pretty sure that data's gone. Other questions? Nope.
Has the info migration to cloud reduced the ransomware thing?
So there's two parts answer to that. So first of all, we see more configuration errors in cloud than we do on-prem right now, because most organizations believe the default security settings in a cloud environment are actually good. They're not. And it would be an underclassification to even call them bad for most customers. So that's part one. And so now your security is arguably less optimized in your cloud environment, and you've basically only moved the same applications you previously had into the cloud. So I would argue that things have got worse. We do see ransomware. A lot of protection is that a lot of these clouds have their own AD infrastructure, and so they've separated the organization from some of their applications. And sometimes for convenience, they just don't synchronize a lot. And that has protected a lot of clients. Not to say that the cloud is any more protected in that environment. It just happens that they're compromising it via a different vector than the cloud aspect of that point. So I would say we are yet to see the really sophisticated attacks in cloud. I worked with a gentleman from one of our 3-letter government agency that claimed he could crack the hypervisor level of any of our cloud vendors within 33 minutes. And he said 32 minutes of that was setting up his PC. I never took him up on the bet, so I don't know, but I'm guessing that, he probably had some confidence behind that. So the worst is yet to come, unfortunately.
Any playbooks that you use, like repeatedly, since your MSSP, right? Utilizing your SOAR capabilities, right? You've seen ransomwares and business email compromises, and what are all the top playbooks that you think, as an organization, you've developed that have become really good use to you?
Yeah, and there's a whole list of them, unfortunately, or fortunately, when you've been in this business so long. But how many people use Proofpoint? How many people have one of the major, call it 3 or 4 EDRs with Proofpoint? So first of all, I'll just use this as an example. CrowdStrike integrates with Proofpoint. A lot of people don't know that. So they'll share their IOCs between applications, which is a really cool feature, by the way. Proofpoint will flag every file that comes in, every URL gets a new URL, et cetera, so we can tell you when anything gets clicked. So a playbook that is easily, I wouldn't say easily, is automatable, not easily, but is automatable, is being able to worry about a machine getting infected via email by integrating the IOC capabilities between Proofpoint and CrowdStrike. Therefore, the only dwell time you have from the time that an IOC is used is whatever short period of time that neither one of those vendors have that IOC. And because Proofpoint basically retags every file, every URL, et cetera, you now know if the user ever clicked that during that dwell time. And so immediately you can detect what was my dwell time from the time IOC was identified, was anything done during that period of time, and with that, did the EDR block it during that period of time as well. So if you talk about closed loop security, like that's an awesome use case for anybody to use that have those technologies. And I only use those, two vendors as an example of what can be done, but most of the ecosystem is getting much better like that. A lot of people call that AI, by the way. So, okay. Yes, sir.
As cybersecurity requirements, the regulations, states have beginning to pick up on that, just like FedRAMP, and I think they started to talk about state ramp, those kind of things.
Yep.
How has that impacted either ransomware or breaches in general?
So I don't know is the answer. If anybody wants to speak up, you're more than welcome to. We do a fair amount of civilian government, which fall under, usually we'll be using FedRAMP. We have not seen a lot of compromises of infrastructure and applications in a FedRAMP environment. We've seen a lot of stolen credentials. We've seen brute force with multi-factor authentication and the user credentials be the primary gain. I don't know if I would make the leap of faith to say it's because it's FedRAMP or because they spend incrementally a little more than the rest of the world when they do a FedRAMP deployment or application in FedRAMP or any of those. I would say the challenge as a vendor side, because I worked at RSA as I mentioned before, is technically when you deploy a product, you want to be able to do iterations quickly. FedRAMP and applications aren't friendly in that cycle. And so a long time in the past, I signed Army as a client, not in this company, in a different company. And we were more or less a SaaS company, so we pushed out everything to every client at the same exact time constantly. They wouldn't let us do that. So they wanted to review every software code before we deployed it. And it took them 12 months on average. Like, you don't need to be working with us because this will not work in your environment. First of all, we're not going to push out 12-month-old code after the fact. But second of all, it wasn't a functional relationship. So, but FedRAMP has some of those limitations as far as recertification and constant. If you have major release, some of the vendors have got good. They no longer call them major releases. Kind of creates a disconnection between their commercial version and their FedRAMP version, but they're called different things to accomplish that. So, but look, any focus on security is a good focus in my mind. So FedRAMP must be better. Incrementally, I don't know how much. I just don't have enough experience to be able to say.
I'm just thinking loud, even with FedRAMP, with what happened with SolarWinds, it's kind of like, you can't catch it, I guess.
Again, once we knew about, SolarWinds, it was easy to catch. And FedRAMP may have had some blocking capabilities that may have stopped it from being infected to start with, or accessing the vulnerability. And FedRAMP does have better outbound blocking capabilities, which in that particular case would have helped protect the environment. I would hope somebody would catch that one pretty quickly in a FedRAMP environment. May take them 6 years to patch it, but. Okay. I want to be sensitive to everybody's time, but any last questions? I greatly appreciate your time. Hopefully the informal format was good, but if you have any questions, please let us know. Happy to answer anything offline as well. Thanks very much.